Good evening. I'm Neil Best, a member of the Board of Directors of Colorado Humanities. Welcome to Whites and Racial Justice. It's the fifth in an ongoing series of programs to encourage understanding and to promote discussion about the legacy of race and ethnicity in America and how together we can make changes now for a more just future. We want to say thanks to our sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Durango Herald, Ground Floor Media and Center Table, Tate Law, Arapahoe Libraries, and the many community partners who are posting or streaming this program this evening. A special thanks to Mike Ferrafino, President and CEO of the Colorado Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and Jesus Carrillo for providing media production services. At this time, I'd like to also recognize the Board of Directors and staff members on our Changing the Legacy of Race and Ethnicity Committee. And a special thank you to Colorado Humanities staff, Josephine Jones, video intern Charlene Emery, and Executive Director Maggie Koval for their commitment in delivering this very important programming. Our moderator for this evening is Dr. Dwinita Mosby Tyler. Dr. Tyler is Chief Catalyst and founder of the Equity Project, a consulting firm supporting organizations and communities in building diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies, and the HR Shop, a human resources firm designed to support nonprofits and small businesses. Dr. Tyler, thanks for leading our discussion this evening.
Thank you, Neil. I so appreciate that introduction. And good evening to everybody. We're so excited to have you join us this evening for what I think will be an amazing conversation filled with complexities, answers, and then more questions. Thank you for participating with us tonight, too. We look forward to you chatting with us about things that are on your mind, things that our esteemed panelists may be able to weigh in on. Before I introduce our panelist, I'd like to just share with you some thoughts about this moment and this movement that we're in right now. I want you to do some reflection along the way as we enter into this dialogue tonight. I want you to think about the many movements that you have been a part of in your lifetime. I don't know about you, but I've seen at least 4 different movements in my lifetime. Some of you remember the 60s, sometimes even the 50s, where we really were focusing on equality. And then some of you entered into this work in the 70s and the 80s when we were in the diversity movement. There we were celebrating differences and also trying to figure it out. Some of you entered into this work in the 90s. That's when the inclusivity movement began. It was when we started to focus on making sure voices were being heard at tables and people had seats at those same tables. The belongingness factor was most important. And then something really interesting happened in the 2000s. We started a journey into a space that we'd not spent much time in, at least in the United States. And that is where we are today. We're talking about racial equity. I want you to be thinking about where you've been in this journey. And as tough as this conversation is, and as tough as this climate is, to always remember that we've not been working on racial equity all that long. Where we've been is just diversity, inclusion, and equality. So as you think about your questions tonight, I want you to be thinking about the framing of it and where we've spent a lot of time. I also want you to know that we all are sitting in something that we call compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is really about being overexposed to too many things that we need to care about. We also sit in that moment today. So as we tee up our wonderful panel this evening, don't forget about placing yourself and centering yourself in some of the questions that will come about and some of the answers that you will hear. And hopefully by the end of our time tonight, there's something that you can walk away with that changes the trajectory of where you will go in your quest to advance racial justice. So let me introduce our speakers, our panelists. First, let me introduce Helen Thorpe, author and journalist, and otherwise amazing human being who will give us a little bit of her thought about how this moment in history, Helen, has shaped you, changed you, augmented you in any way. What has it done in your life? Share that with us, and also tell us a little bit more about you outside of being an extraordinary journalist and author.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you. My dad grew up in Dublin. My mom grew up in rural Ireland, and they moved to this country. And I have kind of a lifelong sympathy for any family that immigrates. So a lot of what I've been doing in this moment in time is trying to reaffirm others in the immigrant community who've really been struggling with what the recent years have been like. I've also just, I guess in my work, I've been partially focused on my writing and continuing to write and moving in new directions there. But even more, I've been focused on teaching. So I've spent a lot more time recently trying to support other people finding their voices and sharing their stories. One example there's a man that I've gotten to know as I've written about refugee resettlement, and he's just somebody with an amazing life story who arrived in this country as a refugee. He's incredibly accomplished, and he's doing leadership work in refugee circles now. And he wants to write a book, and it would be the first time for him writing a book. And he asked if I would help. And so I'm not helping in any formal way, and I won't have any credit, but I just want to support him in his work. So he has a Google document, and he writes when he can. And I just read everything he writes, and I respond in that document. I ask him questions, and I tell him what I'm curious about, and I tell him what I love about his writing, and I give him suggestions. And we have a wonderful dialogue going back and forth. And it's one of the most rewarding things that I've done, helping someone else write a book. And I feel like in this moment in time, it feels good to not be focused only on what I want to write, but helping other people write their stories. And so I have found that really rewarding. And then just in my personal life, I guess I've just been trying to really get outside of my small bubble and broaden my understanding of history, of culture. And so any opportunity I have to diversify what I watch on TV or what I'm reading, I've been very kind of focused on doing that. I've been watching a lot of Korean TV. Korean TV is amazing. I love it. It's on Netflix. You can find it really easily. There's this great TV show, Crash Landing on You, that I recommend as like something you can start with. It's Romeo and Juliet set in North Korea and South Korea. It's totally charming and brilliant and wonderful. So that's just one example, but in all kinds of ways, I've just been trying to broaden my outlook.
Sentiment that you just shared, the sentiment of you've become selfless in the way that you're writing and what you're doing with your writing by writing about others. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And we look forward to hearing from you a little bit more. Let me now introduce you to President and CEO of Gary Community Ventures, Michael Johnston. We'll bring Michael forward. Hi, Mike. Welcome. We have a question for you. I just asked Helen this very same question. As you reflect on this moment and this movement that we're in this country, how has it impacted you, shifted you, changed you, augmented you, all of those things? Give us a little bit of an introduction about who you are and what you're doing, and then weigh in on that question for us.
Yeah, I'm so delighted to be a part of this conversation, Nita. Thank you so much for convening it, and delighted to ever share a stage with Helen, even if it's remote. Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking, I think the words that come for me right now are a sense of hope and a sense of history and a sense of hurry. And I'll just tell you my reflection is, I grew up, when you talk about the phases, it really compelled me. I grew up in the 80s and 90s as a sort of fan and student of the civil rights movement. And I was, Dr. King was my hero for as long as I remember. And I memorized his speeches and read all about Selma. And I, wondered about what it would have been like to have been around in a moment in history of that import. And I had asked everyone I could talk to, parents, grandparents, neighbors, what were you doing in 63 and 65 and 68? And I think I felt like we would never see another moment like that again. And history were things that other people lived through, but not that you lived through. And I think, Nita, it really was the moment of the Mother Emanuel shooting several years ago, where I remember when I was a young kid first learning about the Birmingham church bombing. And I remember how just inhuman it seemed to me that it was possible that an American would target children at church and try to kill them for the color of their skin. And it seemed like when you learned that story in elementary school, that was something that was in America you would never go back to. And then when I had to come to grips with the fact that my America, the America I was raising my kids in, was not one where you would see 4 kids bombed in a church basement for the color of their skin, but one where you would see 8 people killed in a church waiting room based on the color of their skin. And what was more compelling to me was when I looked back, actually, I felt like we failed the test, right? I mean, when you looked at, okay, that was a heinous act, but what did America do? Well, America responded to the Birmingham church bombing by within a year passing the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? And then you think about the march at Selma, right? And the impact of Selma. Well, we lost one person's life at Selma in the same way we lost one person's life when neo-Nazis marched on Charlottesville. But what did the country do after Selma? Well, the country turned around and by 1968 passed the Voting Rights Act. What did we do in the wake of both the Mother Emanuel shooting or the Charlottesville marches? Well, we tried to convince ourselves that was just a small subset of America and not really a national problem to resolve. And I think I remember the night after George Floyd's murder, and I was home working, and it was 11 o'clock at night, and I heard my son up to no good in his room. He was awake, and I came upstairs frustrated, waiting to see what nonsense he was into. And I opened the door, and he was there with a little tiny book light, making this giant portrait of George Floyd. And I thought, of course, like he gets it. He has the sense he's living in a moment in history where he can't sit down. And he too will be doing the things that I did, which is asking all of the adults in his life, like, where were you? What did you do in this moment? What action did you take? And I remember always thinking how inadequate it was, the people that I asked what they were doing in 1965, and it somehow wasn't an answer that said I was in Selma. And I feel like this has given me a sense over the last 2 years that like we are all in Selma now. And the question is, what will we do with this moment? And that gives me a great sense of hope and a great sense of obligation to make sure we get it right.
Raised that as an issue for us to be thinking about is how do we go from caring about something to doing something about it? That is the moment. And it is a recycled moment. In the 1960s, by the way, Mike, I was there. In the 1960s, people were doing something, and it was a collective of people doing something. And this feels like that same opportunity to me, that we might come together to work in a collective to do something. So I appreciate both your comments about that. Let me get at some of the questions that have already come through from people that are watching us, things that people are curious about. And so we think about some of the divides that we see in the country. We're divided politically, we're divided economically. One of the other divides is this urban-rural divide. Urban and rural, real or perceived, it is a bit of a divide. The question from one of our viewers is, that they're curious about this whole urban-rural discussion, and if they need to be taking unique approaches to the conversation depending on where they are. If it's urban, is it one conversation? If it's rural, is it another conversation? What are your thoughts about this divide and what we need to be doing maybe differently as we're in each one of those geographic areas?
I'll jump in because my mom grew up on a very small dairy farm. My grandparents had 20 cows. My cousin in Ireland still runs that farm. And I've tried to kind of explore this a little bit recently in some of my recent work, getting to know people in rural areas of Colorado and writing about their lives. And I do think that the urban-rural divide is a place where if we all try to move toward one another, there are people of goodwill in both urban settings and rural settings who are really eager to bridge this divide. And I think that food is a really great means of bridging that divide. So I've been trying to write about people who are growing food, celebrating people who are growing fruit on the Western Slope in recent work, and just really honoring what they do in providing food for all of us. And I think that they really have a feeling of often being overlooked or left behind by the urban audience. But I want to hear what Mike has to say, so I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Okay, great, Helen. Thanks for that. All right, Mike, Helen just put you on the spot.
I was enjoying listening to her. My first job, I started in rural Mississippi. I started out as a teacher in a rural community. And I think for me, I had two prejudices when I started. One was that, rural communities were somehow more segregated and maybe more racist or less tolerant than urban communities. And that southern communities were somehow less tolerant than northern or western ones, right? As someone that grew up in Colorado, we saw ourselves as maybe above some of those old racial divides. And there were a couple data points that really jarred me, right? I always remember, I think King said the only city he was ever afraid of was Chicago, right? It was like once you went to the north, you saw a whole different sort of violence and fear. One of the most segregated places I ever lived was Boston. If you look at now census tracts of the most segregated and most integrated parts of the country, often the most segregated cities in the country are urban and they are northern. And the more integrated ones tend to be southern and tend to be often more rural. And I think the basic idea, which I'm sure we'll talk about more tonight, is just the ability to be in relationship with people. If you go to small rural towns, there's one Pizza Inn in Greenville, Mississippi, where I lived, and black folks and white folks both go there. It's the only pizza place. And yes, they're still going to separate schools and often living in separate neighborhoods, but there is sometimes more social interaction than you get in big cities. And I was always astounded by, when I would come home to Colorado and people would say, "Oh, what's it like working in a place that's so racist and backwards like Mississippi?" And I learned this statistic, which is if you looked at what the worst state in the country was to live in, if you were a 5th or 6th grade black or brown kid who wanted to be able to go to high school and graduate from college, where did you stand the best chance? Where did you stand the worst chance of finishing college? The worst state in the country is not Mississippi, and it's not Alabama, it's not Tennessee, it's not Georgia. As of 3 years ago, that state was Colorado. It's the single highest college achievement gap for our own kids of any state. And so I think for me, it was a real lesson that it's easy for those of us who live in urban cities and live maybe in more western and northern cities to assume this is someone else's problem. But I find often the people that are more likely to be sitting down at a coffee shop together or at a church pew or at a dinner table are maybe more likely to be in the midst of the hard conversations than some of those of us are in bigger cities.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate that. I grew up in the segregated South, and when integration happened, I found myself in the same position that you just described in the town in Mississippi. We were still segregated in some ways, but there were one or two places where we all came together. So it's important for us to be thinking about how even the worst of times, in some cases, galvanized us in some way, in an odd way. Thanks for raising that. That one brings up another question that I think is important. And I actually get this question a lot, and I'm really interested in the two of you weighing in on it. The question is, how can white people best leverage their privilege to support effective change for social and racial justice without slipping into white-centeredness, white savior syndrome, or any other unhelpful but well-intentioned mistakes? What do you think about that one, Helen?
Well, I guess I've been like all of us, having very deep, really meaningful conversations over the past year or two, 3 or 4, around leadership in our country and what we can all do. And one thing that I've noticed is that in an all-white room or in all-white circles, the conversation is not nearly as robust as when I'm in a more diverse setting. And a lot of times I'm talking to people from, who share an immigrant background, but are people of color. And so those conversations are very rich. But especially with my fellow white women, I find that the conversations are just getting started, I guess would be a nice way of saying it. And there seems to be, I think I feel this myself, a real need to be perfect. And so the only thing that people seem to know how to do right now is to signal their virtue. So they can only share stories in which they are either a savior or a good person, doing something to sponsor racial justice, but they cannot describe themselves in any other terms. And in truth, none of us are perfect, and there's so much room for growth, but we're not yet, I guess, we don't feel safe, or we don't know how to be vulnerable, or we don't know how to explore our failings. And I am seeing this a lot. And I don't know that I have an answer for it, but I think that it's something that I think the real conversations are when we get beyond this, where we are right now. Virtue signaling.
Yeah. Wow. Whew, that's deep. Thank you for that, Helen. Mike, what do you think about this one?
Yeah, I have two thoughts on this, and I'm not sure if they're entirely consistent. They're just what resonates for me when you share it, Nita. I think the first is, this to me feels like, just in my own life, that this has been, for 30 or 40 years, where I feel like my friends who are people of color have had the responsibility to raise and bring and carry this conversation at every step. And they've been expected to always be the ones to push this question. And I feel like if I'm ever on a 40-year walk with a friend and she's carrying the suitcase the entire time, there ought to be a time where I offer to carry the suitcase, which is like the ability for there to be times where I'm going to be the one in the room to raise the question of racial justice before expecting a person of color in the room to have to raise that. I feel like there is just an imbalance here where we have not done our part for a long time. And so we have some making up for past time to do. And so that's part of it. The second one, which I really, I thought what Helen said was profound, and I think one part of it is the ability to share our own story in a way that is truthful. Like every white family that I know, especially the well-to-do ones, have a story about their daddy or their granddaddy or their great-granddaddy who had absolutely nothing and built himself up from his bootstraps and started the first town store, and that led to what is now Target, or whatever the major structures that they now own. And I think hidden in that story is this notion of meritocracy, that if anyone just worked hard enough, they got a chance. And so I look at my story a different way, right? Which is, yes, my dad and mom started a small business where they owned a lodge in the mountains. When my dad got that loan, his record was, he was an alcoholic with a failed marriage and 2 failed businesses. That was not a very good bet to bet on my dad at that point. But you know what? First Bank did. And they gave him a loan in 1968. And I guarantee you that there is no way any black man or woman walks into the First Bank in 1968 and asks for a loan with my dad's record and gets that loan. There's no way they walk in with a perfect record probably and get that loan. And so when you think about all the rest of the story that seems so great to me, I'm from Oklahoma. My my family's very proud of the fact that in 1893, they made the run into Oklahoma. Well, guess what? Where do you think all that land got made available from in 1893? They had to run a whole lot of Native Americans off that land so they open it up to a giant race for a bunch of white folks to come in and take it. And so it's a matter of telling that story in a way that doesn't try to dishonor my, parents or grandparents or great grandparents, but to tell the whole version of the story, which is, yes, they could be flawed and still have worked hard, but they got shots that people of color in this country have never gotten and have actually been systematically denied. And we got to tell that honest version of the story if it's going to feel accessible to all of us.
Yeah, thank you for that. Your stories and your comments here remind me of what I see as a bit of a speed bump that is really interesting. I believe people really do think they need to be perfect on this topic area. And I think we ought to talk about that for a minute. Let me just go down a rabbit hole. Helen, you help me go down this rabbit hole a little bit. I love it. Why do we think we need to be perfect on the topic of racial justice? Where do you think that's coming from, Helen?
I think that part of it is, for somebody like me on the liberal end of the political spectrum, an absolute horror of what we've just seen in terms of who was in the White House from 2016 for 4 years and what that represented, like Mike was talking about earlier, a return to the worst part of our history. So we don't want to be that guy. We don't want to be that racist person. And we know, if we've thought about it, if we've read some history, we know there's a structural situation. And so we know that we've had a cushioned life or an easier time, and that we essentially don't understand the experience in a firsthand way of what it's like to be a person of color. And so we have a habit of falling silent in the room because we're afraid to discuss race. We don't have a lot of experience talking about being white people, because if you're my age, for much of my life, there was like a conflation of whiteness with neutrality, or whiteness with average or common or ordinary. And so if you look at writing that will point out a person of color in the room, but everybody else is not named because they're white, and so they're not identified by their color, that kind of differential treatment of white people is something that we've experienced for so long. It's like the air that we breathe. Mm-hmm. So we're not very good at naming our own privilege or understanding it in a being articulate about it. We're not there yet. Mike, what would you say?
I think you hit it exactly on the head, Helen. The one example I think of this is, how many times do white folks walk into a event, a wedding, a church, and be like, wow, this is an all white wedding. But when you go to a black wedding and you're the only white person at the wedding, you're like, wow, I'm the only white person at the wedding. This is very strange, right? But because you're used to the milieu of all the weddings I go to are probably white, so that would be normal. And so I just think there is a sense of being able to walk in another person's shoes that is compelling. I would, Anita, John Common had this great quote in the chat, which I think I'd love to cede the rest of my time. And I would love to hear your take on the question of how we think about what the role is of white partners in this moment.
I love that. John, thank you for the question. And I've got a philosophy about the question, and it is Dr. Dwinita's opinion of the world. And it is, I don't think we know the difference between charity and justice work. So what I see a lot of when it comes to white saviorism and white centeredness is white people believing that somehow they have to help in charitable ways instead of helping in collective and strategic and active allyship kinds of ways. And so, in other words, I guess what I'm saying to you is, I believe white people don't tend to see themselves as either complicit and a partner in this work, and more about righting a wrong in this work. I think they're very different behaviors. I think when you're looking at something as charitable, needing to remedy, then you're always doing episodic things that absolutely center yourself. When you're working in active allyship, in a collective, where you're trying to be a part of the strategic solution as a partner in the work, it's not episodic. It's for the long haul. And it isn't about you. It's about us. So I do think the notion that we always pay our way out of something, explain our way out of something, and do things that are quick fixes to something keeps us in this white-centeredness. And I guess the obvious thing, and you both have said this beautifully, is centering white as the standard and the profile for everything doesn't help this matter either. And so a part of the work is stepping away from that centeredness, owning and being vulnerable about that white-centeredness as the profile, as the one that has the best voice or the most resources, or, fill in the blank. I struggle in this area a lot in the kind of work that I do, even though right behind my head is the sign that says the Equity Project. You probably would not be surprised to find that oftentimes I have white people trying to tell me about my own history, what's true and what isn't true about it. And it's because we have a white-centeredness in the country. That's where the real work is. That's what we have to eradicate. Yeah. Thank you for that, John. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you too, Mike and Helen too. Well, I have another question. I want to get us on this one a little bit. And Mike, maybe you can start us off on this one. In a largely white organization where people of color have felt marginalized and discriminated against, how does the organization need to recognize and acknowledge that marginalization and discrimination are real? I mean, we've probably heard that in every organization we've been a part of, but what's our responsibility once we hear it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was thinking about this one. This is the test I'm trying to insist for myself now and for the rest of people on our team. Is when you think about any regular business function, right, Nita, it's like you're walking down the hall and your company's got to do a real estate transaction. Someone's like, hey, you know what? We need a good real estate lawyer. Who are 4 or 5 people you'd recommend? I want all the folks on the call think through, like, neighbor asks you for a lawyer. Who are your first 4 recommendations? Mm-hmm. Neighbor asks you for an accountant, a mortgage broker. They need a board member for their nonprofit. Like, go through anything someone might ask you. And I would bet, because most of us are victims of our own networks, if you think through your first 3 or 4, probably almost everyone on those lists are going to be white. Because they're going to be, they grew out of networks that you knew. And so the challenge we've tried to set for ourselves is, what if all 5 of those first 5 people have to be people of color? What's your list? And when you just force yourself to do that mental exercise, all of a sudden you realize in your network are people even greater and stronger and more prepared for that role than you might have thought of. But if you just go to the closest one next to you, you're not often going to get the most representative voice. And so we try to think about in every choice we make, who is going to be the cleaning company for the building, who is going to be our partner in a bank, who is going to be our co-investor on a ballot measure. And then how does every decision we make filter through the lens of race and, for us, of class? And so what does any investment that we make, any decision we make to support, what does that look like? Because we think that those are ones that quietly, historically, have been completely dominated by race, and we haven't always acknowledged that. So we try to, as you said, Nita, try to live in this in the along, in the Gwendolyn Brooks phrase, live in the along, to make sure it's a regular muscle we use all the time, as opposed to once a month we're going to have a session to talk about what we're doing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. How do we actually make sure that's a reflex muscle in every decision we make? That's our first instinct to try it, and our second instinct to analyze it and say, what are the unintended consequences of this choice when we make it?
Great. Thank you for that, Mike. Helen, any thinking there?
Well, I guess I was just stuck with the idea of this being a largely white organization. And I think as long as it is a largely white organization, it's going to be frankly, probably an uncomfortable environment for the few people of color there. And so the best thing you could do is hire more people of color and create a less extreme minority and something more close to parity. If you really want people to be comfortable, I think you got to move in that direction. In the meantime, the one thing that I think you want to be careful not to do, really think a lot about, is if you're going to try to do diversity, equity, inclusion work, I'm not sure that you should go to your few people of color who are already your employees and ask them to do that on top of the jobs that they're already doing in an environment where they might not necessarily feel particularly safe or comfortable, unless they're seeking that opportunity. But it's much better to go to an outside expert such as yourself or others doing this work and bring that outside person in and not put the burden on the person working there. I've noticed with friends who are people of color that they're being asked to do that work by their employers, and I think it's really hard and painful when it doesn't work out exactly the way they hope sometimes.
Yeah, Helen, thank you for saying that. That warms my heart to hear you say it. I often say, why do we continue to ask people of color to do the work to end their own oppression? What is that, and why would that be okay? Again, I actually think it goes back to white centering, where this is an episodic sort of action where you don't have to think it all the way through in that way. So thank you for raising that as something that's really important. While you're both at it on this topic, you're making me think of something else. I have this author, Helen, that I love a lot. Her name is Dr. Barbara Love. And she has created this framework called liberatory consciousness. And in a way, it's a way for us to be thinking differently about this work in particular. And she gets really explicit about the what do we need to pay closer attention to. And one of the things that she talks about in her framework is this. She says that we must all admit that we are in oppressive systems. Even if you're the leader of it, you need to admit that we're all in oppressive systems. And then she says that you have to not get socialized to that. So don't get used to it. Don't normalize it. Don't make it okay. And the last thing she says is, we've got to work on the system while we're in the system. I love the framing of that because it tells us that we don't get to opt out of saying that we've got work to do. She's already saying we're working in these systems that are oppressive. So as you think about that, I want you to be thinking about this question with me. When you look at the challenging realities of our times, we've got challenges in our public lives. We've got challenges in our private lives. Our public lives can sometimes be more integrated, while our private lives are largely segregated. Can you discuss for a few minutes what has worked in your favor when it comes to building cross-racial friendships and relationships? So we've got this pretty integrated public life, this really segregated private life. What have you done to bridge that gap in your own lives to create the building of racial friendships and relationships? Mike, you want to go first on that one?
Yes, and I'm really glad you asked it. And I think also this is a place where people should be honest about it, and then also be able to forgive yourself for the realities of where you are, which is like, I think sometimes people feel trapped by not knowing where to start on this, because I think if you look at your natural default, your church, your neighborhood, your school, your college friends, like whatever your built-in cohort are, they're likely to be quite segregated. And so sometimes small efforts make a difference. For us, what we try to do is one, like seek out communities in places that were different than ours. So whether it was a sports team to sign our kids up, or a school to send our kid to? If we knew our neighborhood was less diverse, then could we make sure and prioritize a school that was more diverse? If we knew our church was less diverse, could we prioritize a sports league or an after-school program that was more diverse as a way to try to make sure our kids had as many of those experiences and we did? And then I think it's about prioritizing times for individual friendships, because maybe you might have a group of friends that you run with as a group. They might be more segregated, and so you're not going to have that built-in group of necessarily a diverse friend group. You have to start one relationship at a time, which is one coffee or one drink or one dinner with one friend, and then an open invite to her house or his house or their family, because I think those groups aren't as pre-made as easily as they might be with other existing networks. So it really often requires more effort. And so I think it's about really making it a priority. And as you said, Nita, constantly analyzing every time you walk into school, what does my kid's class look like? Every time you walk into church, what do the pews look like? Every time you walk into a cocktail party, what does the room look like? And not judging yourself, but being able to say, okay, this doesn't meet what I want my experience to be. How do I find something that looks different? And I think it's continuing to never get comfortable with that, as you said, is I think the most important part.
Yeah, and you know what, Mike, to your point, the same author, Dr. Barbara Love, says this. She says that we all have to build a capacity to notice, which is exactly what you just described. We've got to continue to build a capacity to notice, and we can't just pay attention to the loudest voices, the elephants in the room. We have got to develop discernment so that we recognize and notice the subtleties. We pay attention to what isn't being said. We notice who isn't there. That's building the capacity for noticing. So thanks for raising that as such an important part of what we're talking about right now. Helen, any thinking here?
Yeah. So I do think that many white people like myself can look at their personal bubble and see, is there diversity or is it monochromatic?
Mm-hmm.
If you're living in a white neighborhood and the PTA at your kid's school is mostly white, even if there are many kids of color in the school, but you're just interacting with white moms somehow nonetheless.
Mm-hmm.
If the TV shows that you watch are really white and the books that you're reading are really white, there's a lot that you can change if you want to broaden your outlook. And some of the things that are super easy to change are the books that you're reading or the TV shows that you're watching. And there's an amazing plethora of authors to choose from right now. And I could rattle off a whole bunch of books that I've loved, but getting a sense of the history of this country. What's it been like for African Americans? What's it been like for Asian Americans? Have they always been allowed to own land? And when have they not been allowed to, and why? And what were those laws? What's it been like for Latino people here? What's it been like for Native Americans? I mean, there's so much you can learn. But then how do you get out of your personal context if it's really limited? First of all, I think you've got to just pursue genuine relationships. You can't pursue a friendship with somebody because they're a certain color. Nobody wants to be in that dynamic. Nobody wants to be on the receiving end of it. So you've got to just go with, the people that really resonate for you. And I think that in my own experience, what one can find is that there may be a mistrust. And you might end up asking somebody to take a walk 2 or 3 times or inviting them over to your house 2 or 3 times, and they may or may not reciprocate. And you've kind of got to let things evolve organically. And I find that, sometimes I have to let go of something if the other person isn't really interested in pursuing that relationship with me. But in addition to personal relationships, there's so much you can do in the civic sphere to get out of your own bubble if your bubble is limited. And I learned this by accident because I'm an introvert and I would never go do this sort of thing. But I was married to a very extroverted person for a while. Mm-hmm. And when I was, and when he was in public office and we were still married, I really prioritized going to events where people of all backgrounds, especially the Black and Brown community, those particular events. And I also prioritized events with cultural institutions. But so I went to every year, the Black Chamber Dinner, the Hispanic Chamber Dinner, the Latin American Education Fund, and you can buy a ticket to their events. And there's so many other organizations that you could support. If you can afford it, you can buy a table, or your company might buy a table, and you can go meet people there in that civic sphere. And you can really participate in a broader swath of your own community. And that's just really easy to do. And it's no pressure. And it doesn't get into the dynamics of, is there a good fit interpersonally? So there's all kinds of ways to get out of your bubble.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. You both are saying something that's pretty similar. And that is, one, you have to want to do it. It doesn't just happen all by itself. If you don't want to do it, it's not happening. You are articulating that you have to want to do it. And the intentionality behind this too. It is measured. The building these relationships is a measured process. If it doesn't just naturally happen, then go do something about that. I love that. So thank you. Thank you so much for that. All right, I want to jump around here a little bit. There's so many hot topics. We don't want to talk about critical race theory. We've got, why aren't we talking about reparations? And then we've got everything in between to be talking about. But one of the questions that has come up from one of our viewers here is about reparations. What do you think about it? Do you support it? How do you propose financial or land reparations even be implemented? Just some initial thinking from you on the whole complicated topic of reparations. Mike, you want to start us off?
Yes, I do. And I think one of the, if you haven't read, and maybe you have, one of the other questions was about resources to look at. If you haven't read Ta-Nehisi Coates' piece on reparations in the Atlantic from about 5 years ago, you should. It is still, in the 200-year history of the Atlantic, the most read article in the history of the Atlantic magazine, and it is well worth it. But for me, it was Nicole Hannah-Jones' piece in the Times Magazine about a year ago called What is Owed, which stopped me in my tracks on this. And it was about this fact that if you look at not just the income gap between white families and Black families, but you look at the wealth gap is the largest. And at Gary Community Ventures, our focus is on supporting low-income kids and their families. So we have a two-generation approach to helping families lift themselves out of poverty. And so it's about families with kids. And the place that wealth gap is the single largest is among families with young kids. So Black families with young kids have about $1 of accumulated wealth for every $100 of white families with young kids. That gap is about $170,000 in wealth for white families, about $12,000 for Black families. And when you look at the history of that, it is not by accident, right? It is everything. When people say, "Oh, I'm in the West, I'm not a part of that." Well, if you look at the moment when the country reneged on their commitment of 40 acres and a mule to decide to not give African Americans access to what they were entitled to after the end of slavery, after denying that promise, the country then turned around and opened up 200 million acres of the West to give away to any white family that would settle there, right? That's how people got to Colorado. And when you look at whether it was the GI Bill or whether it was redlining, or every one of those steps that were meant to procedurally deny Black families who were building wealth the chance to keep it. And so I think that this is something that is really important. I support it. I think the most important place to start for us is around ways to try to close the wealth gap. And I think that the way that we're approaching it is we are looking at the single largest lever you can pull to grow wealth is home ownership. And right now in Colorado, 25% of Black families in Colorado are eligible for home loans, have gone to banks, have applied for mortgages, and have been approved. They meet all the criteria. Of those folks that are approved, 97% of those Black families never get a home mortgage, 97%. And the biggest gap there is the ability to make a down payment. And that is because a lot of white families, myself included, got our down payment because you borrowed it from your parents, right? Your parents were able to help you get the down payment on your first home. And that's probably because 50 years ago, Uncle Sam was willing to help my dad get the first down payment on his first business, right? So like that institutional investment has been passed down. I think the step is we have to start by being able to make sure that Black families have access to whatever capital they need. We need to show that America is ready to systematically bet on Black families the way it has for 400 years bet on white families. And so we're starting a fund named after Deerfield. We're calling it the Deerfield Fund, named after the Deerfield Township, our own little Black Wall Street, which is dedicated at home ownership and supporting Black families who need access to down payment support. And the idea is that it's a zero interest loan. It's a loan, people can pay it back, but we'll make sure anybody who wants to get into a house and has the capacity actually does. And we hope that if we do this and start, we get other foundations and other investors, companies to follow, and eventually public dollars should go into this. And then we're going to show when you make these bets on Black families, they're going to 10, 20, 30x that investment in ways that give back to the whole state and the whole country. But it's our obligation to start by making that bet. And for people that are uncomfortable, my argument is, this truth has not been created by race neutral policies, and it is not going to be fixed by race neutral policies. So some people are uncomfortable with us having a fund that's only dedicated to Black and African American Coloradans. And our belief is this country has spent 400 years intentionally excluding that population from benefits. So you can't possibly fix this without making sure they're the targets to be able to get those benefits.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And thanks for your hard work over at Gary Community Ventures too, and really getting laser focused on what it means. The word reparations points in a lot of different directions, and over in your organization, you've gotten really explicit about a part of the reparations process. So thank you for your work on that. We appreciate it.
And that's obviously, as you know, only a very, very small part of the conversation. We're not saying in any way it's necessary or sufficient or even addresses the actual issue of direct payments that people are owed. I think there's a lot more work to do. We're trying to start with a place that we think is scalable in terms of the amount of dollars that we could use to support it. But lots more to do.
Yeah, great. You're chipping away at inequities, so that's fantastic. Helen, what a question. What are you thinking?
Yeah. Reparations make all the sense in the world to me, and I'm in favor of reparations. I think that how to do it is above my pay grade. I'm not qualified really to answer that question. I believe that the experience of African Americans in this country with slavery and with Jim Crow is unique, and that reparations are completely justified based on what happened. I think that there are additional people who've been discriminated against intensely, such as Native Americans, and have lost a great deal. And I don't know how it would work if we were to look at a more an even bigger pool of people. I also think Japanese Americans during the World War II experience, when they lost everything that they owned in many instances when they were put in concentration camps, would, to my mind, qualify for something similar. I think that there are Latino families who had land stolen from them, and that's been, pretty well written about. So there are many different people who I think have been discriminated against in the history of this country, but I just believe that keeping it simple for the time being and talking about slavery in the African American community, I think there's a very clear case in my mind for reparations. I would love to see it happen.
Thank you. Guess who else would love to see it happen? I would love to see it happen for all kinds of reasons that you both have shared with us. Thank you so much for that. A part of this journey together is the way that we started this conversation around people being afraid. What do you think the best approach is to sharing lived experiences in a way that just doesn't foster judgment? I'm seeing a lot of critique and judgment of one another happening in this moment. What do you think the best approach to sharing our lived experiences would be, or what has it been in your own experiences?
I'm just a really big believer in storytelling. And I think that when people argue or make an argument, it can elicit a defensive response from the other side. But if one is able to tell a story of this is what happened to me, I think it's a little bit easier for a listener to maybe put themselves in the shoes of the person if they hear a story. So I just think that's the powerful way to go.
Great, thank you. Mike, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I'd say a huge amen to that point. I agree with that 100%. And I would just add there's one example I use because what you want is stories allow you to walk in other people's shoes. They allow you to see yourself in them and you. And the example I always give of this, and on the education side, I was a teacher and school principal for a long time. And there are two major federal buckets of dollars that support kids with additional life circumstances in the U.S. One is special education dollars, and those go to any kids that have identified special needs. And the other are Title I dollars that go to low-income kids. And the interesting thing is both the U.S. Congress and the Supreme Court has said, literally, you must spend however much money is required to meet a special education student's needs, no matter if it bankrupts your school district. You have to do it. And the Senate has voted to reinforce that. On Title I, they've said, well, we don't have that much money left, and we'll kind of give you what we can and do your best with it. But you know what? Tough's tough. And why is that? Well, that is because special education needs are distributed randomly across the population. So any given U.S. Senator or Congresswoman has a real chance of having someone in her family who has a disability, and they identify with that, and they will stand up for that. Poverty is not evenly distributed across the country, and so there is, by definition, not really a U.S. Senator or Congresswoman who lives in poverty, and so they don't have any deep physical understanding of that. So I feel like when you get to the stories that actually connect with you, you get it. I'll tell you, Anita, the one that got me the most powerfully was Tamir Rice, because I grew up when I was 12 as a kid who sat in my backyard and shot things with a pellet gun, the BB gun. And I would sit there and shoot things out of my backyard, and neighbors would come by and wave at me. And, I got into trouble once or twice with the law when I was a kid. And, the police officer showed up in my house and they stopped. And it turns out the police officer was also my hockey coach. And so, I did sprints for 3 hours that next Friday. But he certainly was going to come up to my house and pull a gun on me in the first 3 seconds when he saw me. And I just think that was, for me, such a visceral connection of I could see myself in him at age 12. And I think the more chances people have to see themselves in the stories, the more it finally connects in a way that you just can't walk away from.
Great, great. I've got the question of the evening. How do we start? How do we begin? We want to advance racial equity and racial justice. If you were writing the book, which Helen probably is already doing, but if you were writing the book, how would it start? How do we begin? What are the first steps of advancing racial justice? Helen, what do you think? And then put Mike and I in the front of your book.
I guess that I'm a big believer that it's important to understand the history and to have like a shared set of facts that we can all agree on. And so, like, to advance racial equity, for example, I think there are many people in the white community who might think, well, slavery was a long time ago and things have been equal for a long time now. So why does somebody of color need different treatment than a white person? You hear that kind of argument, right? And I think that if you really understand the history, it's very obvious that slavery was followed by an era of terrible repression that continued until yesterday. I mean, it's still ongoing.
Yes.
And, if you're going to read one book that's going to help you understand this, for me, it was Isabel Wilkerson, The Warmth of Other Suns. I did not understand post-slavery Jim Crow reality until I read that book. So I just feel like today people are operating with this kind of an ahistorical understanding of the present moment, and they don't get it sometimes. So I wish we could all have a shared sense of what our history is and agree on a certain set of facts. And then I think we could, proceed from there. But I feel like there's just not yet a shared understanding who we are as a country and what has our history been. And this gets into that critical race theory and what are we teaching in schools kind of debate a little bit, but I think we're getting there. I think we're getting to a better place in terms of a shared history that's more representative and more true. I hope so.
I love that, Helen. And not only are we moving towards a better understanding of history, I think we're also starting to dismantle some of the stereotypes. I saw some of that when we made Juneteenth a national holiday. The number of people that had never heard of Juneteenth, we thought maybe that was just white people, only to find out that there were Black people that had never heard of it either. It depended on where you lived in the country. Yep. So this ability to work in a collective that I suggested earlier also means collective learning. It's exactly what you're talking about. I really appreciate that. Mike, any thoughts there about the first chapter of the book? How do we start?
I love this question. I think it is relentless small steps, right? It is the ability to start taking small steps and not stop. I've just been thinking so much, Nita, about your point about movements and the way they change over time. And I think about, for me, when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, environmentalism, the environmental movement at that point was you were people that like went out into the North Atlantic Ocean and strapped yourself to the back of a whale so that they couldn't harpoon the whale, right? That was what it meant to be an environmentalist. And I was like, ooh, okay, I don't think I'm doing that. And then environmentalists became, actually, all you have to do is cut up the little 6-pack soda wrapper before you throw it out. Or environmentalists are just putting paper in the blue bin. When you could do that, everyone in the country was an environmentalist, right? And I think some people have this feeling of, you feel overwhelmed if you don't know where to start. And if you feel like the first step is, how am I as a junior employee going to transform my organization into being an anti-racist company? Like, that feels like a hard, big step. I just so loved Helen's point about books and movies. Like, I was just thinking about a really meaningful part of the pandemic for me was, and I wasn't really intentional. I think after George Floyd, I read all of Colson Whitehead stuff. I read Underground Railroad. I read Nickel Boys. I went back and read Beloved. My son was reading The Hate U Give. I think he read it 4 times. And the feeling to come home to feeling a part of that story makes you feel closer, right? Mm-hmm. And your idea of like, so how do we keep connecting ourselves to the culture? How do we keep asking questions all the time where we are about who's in the room and who's not in the room and why they're not in the room? And then how do we keep just taking small steps towards, maybe let's try a different church this Sunday for one Sunday, or maybe let's go to Shorter for a Sunday, or maybe let's sign our kid up for a different sports team this year that might have a totally different set of kids you get to play with. I think those kind of relentless steps, we're not slowing down, but being okay with them being small if they're relentless, I feel like gives us all the path into how we can all be warriors for racial justice.
Yeah, thank you for that. I always look at what we're talking about on a continuum. I've got like continuums in my brain. And one of the continuums that supports exactly what you're both saying is we have to decide whether what we're doing is performative, whether what we're doing is status quo, or whether what we're doing is strategic. And if we can question ourselves relentlessly around where we fall on that continuum in the work that we're doing to advance racial equity, it tells us what we ought to be doing next. I get a chance to, in my work, see a lot of things that are performative, a lot of things that are status quo, and a lot less things that are strategic. And so my wish for all of us is that we get in the lane of strategy work on how we're doing this. And if each one of us did just our little part on the advancement of racial equity and justice, imagine the world we'd live in if you multiplied each one of us by the other. I want to end with something similar with you. You've been so wonderful as panelists. Your insights have been extraordinary. And I want to leave the audience with a wish from you. So here's the framing of the question. I want you to leave the audience with some resources. Maybe they're resources, books, or any resource that you have had that really has helped you in this journey. Share any of those. But I also want you to leave them with a parting word of inspiration, because I think we need that in this work, whether you're talking about white people in justice work or everybody else in justice work. We all need a little beacon of light in the process. So your word of encouragement and inspiration, and any resources that you would like to share with the audience. And Helen, may I start with you?
Yeah, you can. I'm reaching over to this stack of books I have near me. I just want to share some books that I've been reading recently, because these are by Denver authors. This is Khadija Queen's book, I'm So Fine. And Khadija and I both teach at Lighthouse Writers and Regis University. She's an amazing poet. This is a collection of her kind of feminist poetry. But she wrote an essay in Harper's Magazine about the pandemic that was simply, it just took my breath away. It made me, my fingers and toes turn green with envy because it was so beautifully written. I wish I had written something so gorgeous, but it's about her experience as a Black woman in the pandemic with the health disparities and watching so many people in her community get sick. And it's just an extraordinary piece of writing. And she's just somebody I look up to and admire a whole lot. And another book that I'm reading right now, this is Sabrina and Karina, and it's written by Kali Fajardo-Anstein. She's a Latina author based here in Colorado as well. This is a collection of short stories, and it's gotten a ton of attention. Sandra Cisneros blurbed it here. And I just really, her stories pack such a punch. They're set here in Denver. They're about young Latina women and some of the challenges that they face in violence against women and their grace and their beauty. And it's just, I love seeing the work that other people in my community are doing that just knocks my socks off and makes me really excited. So I just share that in case people are looking for things they might want to read. I recommend both those authors.
Awesome. And Helen, what words of inspiration do you have for our audience to keep going in this journey for justice?
I think that things will get better and better on this front as younger people step into leadership roles. When I look at my son's generation, he's just had so much more of a chance than I ever did when I was growing up, when I was his age, to have a diverse circle around him. So he's been at DPS schools where he was either in the minority or right at 50-50 in terms of the percentage of white people in the building. And he just really gets it and understands that we are a diverse country. And he understands that in his bones in a way that people my age and older, we may not have grown up with that gift of a very diverse experience when we were at school. I didn't. And so I just think as young people of all backgrounds, I look at their grace and their elegance and their ability to connect with one another, be gentle with one another, show respect to one another. They're better at it than we are, people of my generation. So I think they're going to get it right. That's where I get my inspiration.
Thank you, Helen. I join you in that sentiment. Mike?
You bet. I think my only, on resources, I would add for sure to make sure people have the Ta-Nehisi Coates piece in the Atlantic on reparations, for sure. Nicole Hannah-Jones' piece on What Is Owed from the New York Times. If you haven't read Colson Whitehead's novels on the Underground Railroad and Nickel Boys' first ever back-to-back Pulitzer Prize winner in American history, you should read those. This is the living in a moment of history. P. Jones Faulkner is one of the only two-time winner of all times. And so the idea of we are among the real greats is inspiring. Then I would say on the light side, my son decided he wanted to start a business over the pandemic because we watched Self-Made, which was the Netflix series about Madam C.J. Walker with some Denver roots. A great story, a great series if you want to watch it. I love that she's now his emblem for entrepreneurship in America, as he wants to be Madam C.J. Walker. And the other one, if you are a sports fan, as I watch with my sons, a great series called All American right now, which is about a football player, a high school football star in California, but it's an all-black cast. I love those pieces. But I'd say for me, for me, the moment of hope is actually caught in even the most challenging moments we're facing right now. And so to go back to the very opening, I think I talked about the Mother Emanuel shooting in South Carolina. And what was actually most hopeful and most heartbreaking about that story is after they caught the shooter and they interviewed him in the police headquarters, and he starts talking about, if you read the transcript, it's stunning, because he walks in to this church with the plan to shoot all these people. And he doesn't even get to the door before someone says, "Oh, welcome. So glad to see you. We're so glad you came. Why don't you sit right down here? We got some food. Would you like something to drink? Do you want a snack? Where are you from? Have you met Brother Bishop?" And before he can know it, he's actually seated in the prayer group. Mm-hmm. And astonishingly, he sits there for an hour, for a full hour. And he talks about in his interview how disconcerting it was to him that nothing he saw in that hour matched anything he had been told. And it was as you can feel the battle within him, which is 22, 25 years of hatred and prejudice and bias that he'd been taught, you almost could undo with 60 minutes of just sitting next to the person you thought you had judged. And I just kept thinking about what would it have meant if he just had one Little League coach who was black when he was 12. If he had just had one teacher, if he just had one neighbor, like the ability for us to undo that evil is actually dramatically on our side. Like the arc of history is long, but bends toward justice in that way, because people desire fundamentally to be close to each other again. And if we just give each other that chance over and over, I think it's going to do the work. And so I think even in our hardest places, the ability to just find the way to put ourselves in uncomfortable situations and try to build fellowship again, even in the small steps, I have every belief is going to find our way out.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, I too, right along with you, believe that equity is in our sight line. And I want to personally thank both of you for your contributions to making that a reality. I want to thank both of you too for your voices tonight. Not only what you had to say, but I have a small sneaky suspicion that you've got way more that you will be saying. So thank you. Thank you so much for sharing the deepest parts of you tonight, the vulnerabilities and the truths about this topic called equity and justice. It's been a pleasure to be in this conversation with you. And on this note, we thank the audience as well, and I will hand it over to Neil Best to close us out.
Thank you, Dr. Tyler, Senator Johnston, and Ms. Thorpe for sharing your knowledge and insights this evening to help us better understand the legacy of race in America. And thanks to the audience and audience members for participating with us this evening. We want to thank our sponsors and our partners as well. We can't stop here. The conversation needs to continue, and you can be a part of that. Continue the conversation online in our Legacy of Race Facebook group and at future programs. Please sign up for news at the bottom of the page of Colorado Humanities website, coloradohumanities.org. Our next program in this series, planned for October 6th, will focus on reimagining policing. On behalf of the Colorado Humanities, thank you for being with us and have a good evening.